So as I said, today I have a confession to make. I was asked to come here today because people have come to think of me as the methods girl, a data geek, a method-holic. But actually, I'm a placeaholic. Methods, data, definition, rationalism, they're just my drugs of choice I use to feed my place addiction. I very much embrace the notion that if you cannot measure it, it doesn't exist. But not for the sake of measurement itself, but for the sake of changing it, for the sake of convincing other people to change it, for the sake of communicating the value of urban design. But I didn't start out this way. This is my hometown, Wechete, Miami, where my most exhilarating memory is playing an ersatz game of Frogger as I tightrope down pencil-thin sidewalks, dodging cars, as I cross strip mall-lined highways, masquerading as streets, all to get to a chicken teriyaki sub. Growing up in Miami, especially as a carless teenager, sucked. This was life. This was work. This was play. Catty corner from another form of play. This was our best hope for place. I always say the best place to find Miami's soul is within a tired strip mall along an otherwise placeless artery at the famous Versailles Café. This is a typical scene outside of the Versailles Café window, La Ventanita, where all the Cubans gather around talking about their heydays on the island. I don't blame them. I'd miss this place too. Miamians, Cuban exiles or otherwise, are obviously starving for place, creating it out of whatever they can. But what Miami lacked in place, I made up for in passion. Ironically, I owe my intimate understanding of the power of place, or lack thereof, to Miami. I desperately wanted to fix Miami, to help create place. I thought if we could only convince people, show them the power of place, its value, that things could change. Even then, I was convinced better places did better all around. I just needed to find a way to prove that to people. For a while, I thought I would do that as an architect. I'd studied psychology as an undergrad, but had always been interested in design as a way to create solutions to problems. Guess that's probably what drew me to psychology as well. But as a grad student in architecture, I was just too much of a social scientist. I was less focused on the nuts and bolts of design and more on the question, how will this make people feel? What has been done in the past that has been successful in producing an emotion and facilitating a behavior? I left architecture school as I didn't feel I was being trained to answer those questions that were particularly important to me. I was so confused. My friends joked with me, well, you could design houses for psychologists or psychoanalyze architects. Yeah, guys, thanks. Great advice. So, needing to make some money, I took a temporary detour. I worked at a global advertising agency. But my very first day there, I absolutely hated it. It was 4:45, and no one seemed to be getting ready to go. It was like, wait a second, this job is from 9 to 6 and not 9 to 5, and effectively more like 9 to 7 or 8. I don't get to be creative. I don't get to solve problems. What had I done to myself? So 5 minutes into this major life crisis, I typed into Yahoo, as this preceded the Google days. I'm older than you think. Psychology and architecture. And I found this woman who had a PhD in psychology and a master's in architecture. Yes, I wasn't crazy. There are other people out there who want to fix places as a vehicle to fix people. So 1 year later, I was a first-year PhD student at UC Irvine, clamoring for research experience. I began working with a team evaluating the Safe Routes to School program in California. It was in that project that I first dipped my toe into the world of methods. It was the first time that I had heard the term walkability, and the first time that I thought about health as it related to the power of place. We evaluated 16 schools throughout the state of California using an urban design audit tool that measured about 20 built environment features, like sidewalks and road width. But we encountered so many more urban design issues that children were battling with on an everyday basis just to get to school. Overgrown bushes making an already 3-foot tiny sidewalk effectively unusable, forcing kids to walk along the road or do a balancing act on a 1-foot wide sidewalk curb. Or in other cases, forcing them to step over the barricade that was placed between the sidewalk and the road to purportedly keep people safe. I realized that this was the early days of measuring urban design. It was 2001. But I knew we were not capturing so much that mattered to our perceptions, safety, behavior. I also began to realize that the whole of urban design was bigger than the sum of its parts. I became obsessed with understanding what influenced people's decisions to walk. I got a lot of personal practice at this. I didn't have a car for my very first 2 years in Southern California. Very proud of that fact. And I have seen it all. Well, I thought so until I started working in China, but that's a whole other talk for a whole other day. So I couldn't get out of my own head. Every time I took a step, I took copious mental notes about the design features that were influencing me. The setbacks, the height of buildings, the trees, the views, the colors, the windows, the smells. I thought about Malibu's beautiful but sidewalkless landscapes. I thought about Irvine's beautiful yet useless sidewalks abutting the uttermost boring of cookie-cutter shopping plazas. I thought about the older parts of LA that had great bones but didn't feel quite safe or inviting as a pedestrian. I thought about the quaint scale of Laguna Beach. I thought about the dynamic nature of the streets of Santa Monica. I realized that not everything mattered in the same way at the same time. That's when I wrote The Hierarchy of Walking Needs. My aim was to organize all of these different elements of urban design that mattered based on what was most fundamental for a walk to occur, starting first with accessibility or having somewhere to walk to and on, perceived safety from crime, not feeling like you're going to be in danger, pedestrian comfort, not feeling like you're going to get run over or feeling like you belonged as a pedestrian, and finally, pleasurability, the things that made a walk interesting and enjoyable. I argue that in most cases, you needed to address the most fundamental needs first. So if you think of Irvine as an example in which many of the streets were quite aesthetically pleasing, but you had no real reason to walk on them in terms of getting to a destination. My aim was to provide a framework for those studying the links between urban design and physical activity, to encourage people to analyze the built environment features as a composite of various urban design dimensions, the way they occurred in real life, instead of just evaluating the impacts of single features like sidewalks. My goal was to indeed produce a better methodology. I had begun to become the methods girl. But it wasn't until the Irvine, Minnesota inventory that I got the opportunity to really geek out. So with funding from the Robert Johnson Foundation through Active Living Research, we were tasked to establish an objective built environment audit tool that would allow researchers to test the relationship between urban design and health. We visited dozens of neighborhoods. My job was literally to jot down everything I could possibly think of that would influence our choices to walk. And ironically enough, I had to, at that point, buy a car to do so. I remember driving through Barstow and thinking, oh, yeah, a jail. That might actually impact our decisions to walk. We might want to put that into the instrument. It didn't make it to the final version, but. So throughout this process, I combed through the good, dynamic public plazas encased by engaging retail within buildings full of character, organized chaos with various forms of mobility living side by side that prioritized the pedestrian, the importance of lighting, the contribution of the whimsical, the delicate balance between the private and the public, the active and the intimate, the importance of urban parks and providing access to nature, the provision of bicycle infrastructure, and how a couple of chairs and tables transform streets into buzzing centers of activity. You know those people are having fun, and that feeling is infectious. For me, that's what's most amazing about just going for a walk in a city filled with great places. The juxtaposition of the highbrow and the ordinary, the interactive possibility of design in creating true civic spaces, offering different opportunities to sit, rest, linger, and watch other people, one of the best things to do in great places. And adapting that to all climates and types of places, and noting the resiliency of the human spirit, even when we're not provided official places to sit or we're explicitly barred from it. The dynamic effect of food within the urban landscape, a personal passion of mine. The colors, the smell, the access. Playing with color and light and understanding nightscapes. Having little nodes of activity and hidden retreats. The desire for personalization. Admiring the so ridiculously quaint I want to hug it facade. Appreciating absolutely perfect urban form and scale. And then the bad. Encountering so many obstacles along the way. So many times we're told we're not wanted or not thought of or not prioritized. When the sidewalk literally does end. Where there literally is a disconnect. When landscapes are littered with homogeneous, never-ending rivers of strip malls, which force us to drive from one to the other even when they're right across the street from one another. When it's obvious we're purposely not meant to traverse a place. And finally, the ugly. I think this whole process was officially the no turning back point for me. I became that girl who could not help but indulge in incessant commentary about the built environment and the public realm every time she stepped foot outside, and mostly framed as what needed to be fixed. I call it advanced people watching, a la William White, the grandfather of what I do. It's the one key skill I try to impart onto my urban design students, but if you're not an urbanist, oh my gosh, my poor fiance, I have to tell you, bless his heart, he walks with me all the time, and he sees me do this firsthand. And the funniest thing I've caught him now several times, beginning a sentence with, "From an urban design perspective," it's hilarious. And I was like, yes, I've done my job. So anyway, we do, when we go on vacation, we do try to incorporate some non-urban spots, just for both our sakes. I have a lot less to say about fields and mountains. So in the end, we ended up identifying 241 items, and after a series of reliability testing, 162 of these ended up in the original IMI. It was great. We'd done it. We'd measured urban design. But we had built a tool for measurement's sake. I've since fielded dozens of calls from researchers and practitioners asking us how to use this thing. And as the grad student on that project, I was really the only one who knew what to do with it. But even before the ink was dry in the IMI, I met a group of urban brokers, renegades from Houston. Sorry, it's Texas. But they wanted to tell the story of place, or lack thereof in their case. They planned to rank several neighborhoods in Houston based on their sense of place. As the purported methods girl, I asked them, well, how are you guys planning to do that? They had absolutely no clue. They were planning to have a group of experts subjectively judge these places. So enter light bulb moment. So hey, I have this tool. I was forced to come up with a quick and dirty methodology, the very first version of my state of place algorithm, which I'll get to later, to use the IMI to tell a story about neighborhood's sense of place. We gave each of the 12 neighborhoods grades and everything, and in 2005. Now I really thought I had my eureka moment. We thought this would incite these neighborhoods to think about place, to compete on the basis of place. But again, this was 10 years ago. Even if we had begun to define the nuts and bolts of great places, it couldn't just be about health. It couldn't just be about sense of place. I still had to show them the money if I wanted them to consider the place in the equation. I realized I had to learn a whole new language and method, the language of real estate, economics, and finance. I audited real estate development class, jumped feet first into an intense relationship with Urban Land Institute, which I still have, got countless headaches from trying to figure out all of the jargon and, oh my God, the acronyms. If you think we urban planners and designers have acronyms, wow. So as I was slowly absorbing the concept of mezzanine finance and cap rates, I had one pivotal conversation with one of my many new real estate friends who worked for a large insurance company about how they chose which projects and which deals to invest in. He rattled off a whole bunch of jargon, but none of them had to do with place. Far from it. They didn't even really know what most of these buildings looked like. I was floored. I made it my quest that day to measure the value of urban design, to truly use methods to feed my place addiction. No, actually, to convince others that they should feed my place addiction. So my first foray into a bilingual bi-methods project was with my dissertation, where I evaluated the redevelopment of failed malls into mixed-use neighborhoods. I looked mainly at sense of community, as that's what developers were promising as a result of these transformations, and my dissertation committee forced me to focus. But I did find a significant positive relationship between urban design, using the next iteration of the state of place algorithm, and the number of visits people took to buy or shop at these places. And it turns out that that early index was twice as important in predicting the number of times people shopped at these places than was their household incomes. I knew I was onto something, but I needed concrete dollars and cents if I was going to convince the big boys in real estate to change the way they made decisions, to consider the bottom line on place. Okay. And then came the Brookings study. I finally had the opportunity to truly tie built environment features not just to walking, health, sense of place, and community, but to economic value. We gathered IMI and real estate data from over 60 different neighborhoods in the Washington, D.C. metro region that were sampled from over 240 neighborhoods along a continuum of walkability from the auto-dominated exurbs to the highly walkable core. We used a meta-analysis that had examined the results of dozens of studies evaluating the relationship between the built environment and walking to guide the development of the first official state of place algorithm, finally. I created a comprehensive index ranging from 0 to 100 to make sense out of those 162 data points we were gathering with the IMI. I'll go into that more in just a little bit, but first, the real eureka moment. As the state of place index increased, so did a variety of other real estate values. Specifically, we divided the index into 5 levels of walkability, or quality of place. And for each level increase, we saw premiums of nearly $9 a square foot in office rents, $7 a square foot in retail rents, an 80% increase in retail sales, a $300 per unit increase in residential rents, and more than $81 a square foot in for-sale residential value. When you aggregate what that means in terms of going from the lowest to the highest level on state of place, the numbers are quite startling. And all in all, these premiums have serious implications from economic development in terms of retail and property tax bases. But perhaps more important to you, if you were to apply these numbers in terms of the magnitude of impact relative to Oklahoma City, if it were to move up 4 levels, it really starts to weave a tale of why place matters. If this slide doesn't create an objective narrative for the power of place, I'm not sure what else can. And if you extrapolate out what this means in terms of economic development, even when just talking about moving up 2 state of place levels, there is considerable unlocked potential throughout this city, at least with respect to value that can be generated from the built environment. That's basically a double increase in both retail sales and the tax rate. Okay, so I've tried not to bore you to this point with the nuts and bolts of what I do, and I promise I won't start here, but I will tell you a little bit more about state of place, how it works, and how we're using data to quantify what people love about cities to help make them better. So in the last 3 years since the Brookings study, we got the opportunity to update the underlying IMI audit tool when we applied it to the Chinese context. We refined many of the existing inventory items, deleted extraneous items, and added items mainly related to pedestrian and bicycle barriers and architectural and building quality. In the end, we ended up with 286 items, all collected at the block level. So all raters must go through a training process to ensure the integrity and reliability of the data, including a video training and quiz. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes per block to collect this data, and we use the State of Place app to do so, which significantly streamlined the process relative to back in the paper and pencil days, which I started with. So one of the advantages is that virtually anyone can be trained to collect this data, including high school students and community members, allowing the opportunity to foster community engagement along with collecting quantitative data. As I mentioned previously, the State of Place Index itself is a score from 0 to 100. You don't need to have every single 286 items present to achieve a score of 100. Rather, 100 represents the highest observed score from our continuum of very low to very high walkable neighborhoods, so it's a realistic goal. The index is broken down into 10 urban design dimensions, all of which have been empirically linked to whether or not people walked, identified in the meta-analysis that I mentioned earlier. And each of the individual sum-dimensions is also scored from 0 to 100. So the algorithm is structured in such a way as that it's not additive, but it's interactional, so it calculates if, then, what scenarios. And overall, what this does is create the state of place profile, which provides a really quick snapshot of how a neighborhood is doing from an urban design perspective. And one can identify its built environment assets and needs, starting to set priorities for how best to address the needs of a neighborhood. And more on that in a second. It's also broken up into 4 sets of urban design features reflecting that hierarchy of walking needs I talked to you about. So first, starting with the urban fabric, or the nuts and bolts of the neighborhood, its bones, the various types of destinations to walk to, the level of human comfort for the pedestrian, and liveliness and upkeep. Now, these are organized in terms of their level of resiliency, or how hard it would be to change them once they are in place. It's much harder to fix an existing urban fabric than to add some sidewalks and trees. So this starts to influence, again, the recommendations that come out of this profile. So I'm going to walk you quickly through the 10 dimensions. For density, we're measuring building compactness and height, so not so much population density. This is particularly important in terms of making it feasible to have enough destinations to walk to within a reasonable walking distance. So it can influence the scale of the city. Is it a car city or a people city? Related to that is urban form. Here we're measuring streetscape continuity, so we take into account building setbacks, how the building meets the street, the siting of buildings, and the number and width of buildings. This is what I like to call the huggability of a street. If the form is off, a street can feel aloof or suffocating, so you know you achieved the right proportions of setbacks, street width, and building height when it feels like a street is hugging you. In terms of connectivity, we're measuring the relative ease of getting from one part of the neighborhood to another, as well as the presence of barriers to pedestrians or bicyclists within the block itself. So I know you guys have all been there. If there wasn't a fence, road, highway, insert barrier of your choice here, you could actually walk to your neighborhood restaurant in 5 minutes instead of what effectively becomes a 25-minute walk. So you take the car instead. Proximity refers to the diversity of the land use mix, so the number of non-residential land uses there are to walk to. So literally how many of your daily needs, services, and amenities are present within a certain distance of you. With parks and public spaces, we include the presence of hard and softscape public spaces, as well as their quality and accessibility. So these are the soul and life of neighborhoods. They're the city's living rooms. Along with museums and monuments, these are the places you bring your friends and families to when they come visit you. I can tell a lot about a city based on how people use their public spaces. We also look at recreational facilities separately. This is getting a bit more at recreational walking instead of destination walking, but the literature has found this to be particularly important for physical activity, so we measure the presence of outdoor and indoor physical activity facilities. Pedestrian and bike amenities refer to aspects of the built environment that make it comfortable or pleasant to be a pedestrian, so sidewalk presence and quality, seating, bike lane presence and type, street trees, etc. Along with form, these are the features that truly help distinguish car-focused neighborhoods from people-first places. They are the first things that the things that make you want to linger. Along with that, we look at traffic safety. Here we're mainly focusing on the quality and safety of the intersection, as well as the presence of traffic calming features. These include the presence of curb cuts, crosswalk markings, traffic standards, and on-street parking. These are the features that help manage all of the mobile members of the public realm: people, strollers, bicyclists, scooters, cars, buses. Now, aesthetics goes beyond the visually pleasing. It also includes aspects of urban design that make places more dynamic and inviting. We look at the transparency of buildings, colors, outdoor dining, street trees, building maintenance, ground floor uses, etc. This is charm, character, the wow factor, the things you most remember about places. Finally, personal safety refers not to actual crime data, but rather the aspects of the built environment that influence our perceptions of safety. So these are called physical incivilities and include features like graffiti, litter, broken windows, abandoned buildings, and lighting. And these features actually influence walking rates more than incidents of actual crime. So what does this all mean for Oklahoma? How can these methods, this amount of definition, actually be weaved into a data-driven story that will help enhance your state of place? When you look at a street like this in Norman, where do you start? How do you convince others to want to start? How can you use methods to feed your place addiction? So State of Place is an urban data analytics platform. We're currently taking steps to convert the analytics I've been conducting on the back end into a user-facing software. And by the way, we're currently recruiting strategic clients that want to work with us to build this out, so come see me after if you're interested. So what we're doing with State of Place is first helping set priorities among the landscape of neighborhoods within a region, what levels of investments or interventions are needed across the region, and what kind of investment structure is called for, private, public-private, or nonprofit NGO. And next, we're helping set priorities within a neighborhood itself. So we use something called multi-criterion assessment for that. So rather than bore you with what that means, let's set up a scenario. Imagine if you had a certain budget for an airline ticket, but you wanted to get the most bang for your buck, balancing your preferred airline, your preferred airport, specific times, dates, nonstop versus layovers, duration of layovers, everything else. Now, if there was an app that weighed the importance of each of these factors and pointed to your ideal flight given your budget, that's basically what we do for neighborhoods. And by the way, if somebody wants to make that app for travel, thank you very much. Please do so. So we weigh 5 things. First, the performance of a neighborhood along each of the 10 urban design dimensions, the index score. Second, how important certain outcomes are to you, like walkability, retail rents, office rents. So at this moment, we incorporate goals for which we have data. What I outlined for you earlier in terms of the Brookings findings. But we're partnering with researchers to expand this list to include broader economic development factors like number of jobs, number of startups, etc. The third thing is the predicted impact of improving a certain urban design dimension on each goal or outcome. So this is based on regression analyses we've conducted from which we've extrapolated a standardized magnitude of impact that ranges from 0 to 1. I'm happy to chat more about with you later, but I don't want to geek out too much and lose you. The fourth is the feasibility of changing a specific urban design dimension. So something like I was mentioning before, connectivity is harder to fix than something like pedestrian amenities. And finally, if the community was involved in the data collection process, we're then able to compute an average score that measures how important and satisfied the community is with each of the urban design dimensions. So in the end, the dimension with the highest score is prioritized, as it will essentially give you the biggest bang for your likely limited buck. Same as with the flight ticket. So it's sort of like an exponentially better version of an existing condition analysis. We go beyond the state of place profile itself and use methods to help you set and justify evidence-based priorities. Here we can see how any dimension, in this case traffic safety, which in this case came up on top, parses out within the study area. The other key thing we do with the state of place is identify the specific interventions and or development proposals that would have the biggest impact on state of place and also create an economic justification for those projects. So if you were to compare interventions, you would choose among the different urban design dimensions to compare, then choose from different types of interventions that would boost the scores for those dimensions and enter their project cost. You would choose a benchmarking goal by which to compare them. Again, these are the metrics for which we currently can predict the relationship to state of place for. And then we calculate how those interventions would change the state of place score and what the corresponding predicted return on investment would be for that project. So this is kind of like one of the money slides, right? We use that same impact score, the relationship between state of place and these key outcomes, that predicted relationship, to calculate what this number is. So really starting to create the economic rationale for these projects. And we can do the exact same thing for development proposals, entering the different project costs, choosing the benchmark or goal, and then calculating the ROI on place. We're doing this currently for one of our clients who's managing a $30 million equity fund focusing on underserved neighborhoods in Boston. They're using State of Place to help identify which development projects will have the most impact on place and health, and ultimately informing which ones they actually fund. We could do the same for this scenario here in Norman and create a data-driven story to make the case for place. The good news is that if my hometown, Miami, finally has begun to figure this out, so can Oklahoma City, believe me. Today, my mission was to lead you through the journey of how I ended up being the methods girl, to show you that they are and indeed should be used as a means to an end. Use them as I have to not just feed your own place addiction, but to spread a pandemic of place-aholicness. Data-driven storytelling about the power of place is worth infinitely more than the zeros, ones, and twos behind it. Thanks very much.